Okay, hi everyone. Here is the review video for Contemporary Issues in Design 2018. As I've said several times, this is not going to be a super in-depth, thorough review. I'm just going to make some key points. I will assume that you know what I'm talking about. I'm going to be referring to some things that as I talked about in lecture. Uh, if you don't know what I'm referring to, if you don't know the background of some of the information on the slides, I encourage you first to Google it. Everything we talked about is pretty mainstream. There's plenty of information out there of its particular designers. Certain examples we looked at, you can find on Google. However, also, of course, I'm available. Email me with questions, and I can try to help wherever possible. Okay, so let's move. We began by talking about kind of the history of the relationship between design and craft and design, and of course art and craft and design. We talked about that in history 2 years ago. I wanted to talk about Giotto, and I want to include him in this review because he was this guy who was well known as an artist, and yet he was hired by the city of Florence to build their cathedral bell tower in the beginning of the 14th century, or the first part of the 14th century. And this is just an interesting piece in the story of design. A guy who was known for painting on two-dimensional surfaces, painting very well, was well known and celebrated as a painter. To think that he could then approach not just a three-dimensional project, but a massive and structurally sound, important project too. It's also important that he designed it and bricklayers actually built it. That difference was something we talked about in class. And again, the difference between the artist designer versus the material craftsman is something that Giotto's story is interesting to encapsulate. We've traced through history, we jumped around quite a bit. I wanted to definitely make sure we talked about the Bauhaus. They'll come back again. Again, here we are, Bauhaus founded in 1909, moved around a little bit in Germany, finally shut down by the Nazis in the 1930s. But for a while there, they hoped to use design combined with industry to re-engage ideas of craft that perhaps have been lost. And so here you have a craft design story that's very important to us directly, although it's now 100 plus years ago. It's still very relevant in our world. Just wanted to point this out. This isn't too hugely important. There are other comparably important exhibitions, but it was an interesting piece. And although it was in Britain, it did have a significant impact in the United States, in Canada, and even in Europe more broadly. What I really was drawing from here, the important point, was how European designers, again, especially the British, but also very much the French and the Germans too, came and overcame the problems of the Second World War. I'm talking not in general, I'm talking about basically design and material problems. There were much more, there were many, many problems, of course. But when we're talking about the designers, how they took a lot of design lessons that had come out of the war and then applied them into civilian peacetime solutions. Interesting. And the Britain Can Make It exhibition was kind of one of the kickoff points of that. In a way, a continuation of ideas from the Bauhaus, but only sort of tangentially. Moholy Nagy, the Hungarian, but known for his connection to the Bauhaus, this idea that he encapsulates, and if you don't remember him, I put him up here, this idea of the complex whole, the special job. The designer has a special job in the complex whole. Again, as for this test, I'm not going to quiz you about his life history or his biography, but what this whole idea, this complex whole thing means, we talked a lot about in lecture. As with Papanek, we obviously know him from the reading we did. His idea kind of comparable to that, this idea of the matrix of life, the complexity and the role that designers have, and of course design for human beings, which we'll come back to in a second. This one example of his design work, he designed the prototype on the left here. It's his design for a chair. The idea being that it was comfortable, it had a new style to it, it wasn't just the same old chair, but it was also made out of fairly inexpensive and, more importantly, locally available materials, so that he could then hand off the design to local people, and they could make it. You see, there was a slight adaptation, a simplification of the legs, but otherwise, uh, the production line that came from this initial design was fairly consistent with the original ideas. Uh, the important point here is not just this chair itself, but this idea of designing something that can then be handed off to other people. And it was a benefit to the people in an area that was quite poor, that had been hit by several waves of, without going into the history of North Carolina, of the United States, um, a series of impacts to the local economy and the local culture, and this was some small way to contribute and help those people get themselves back on their feet, and that was the important thing for Papineau. Buckminster Fuller, of course, again, we talked a lot about him. It's important to know about his Dymaxion idea. We talked about the Dymaxion car and how impressive and interesting and exciting that was, and what a shame it never took off. We talked about the history of the geodesic dome. That's kind of what he's most known for. Here you see some sketches. Here you have him with a sort of a complete a model for an entire sphere, the dome being kind of a piece of that. Dymaxion being his kind of, it is his made-up word, combination of dynamic, maximum, and tension. We see this, we see the Dymaxion house, we see the Dymaxion car. What I wanted to show was the Dymaxion map as well, this projection of the world that shows the Earth in a very different kind of way. Now, of course, in a way it's familiar, we know what that looks like, but when we see it arranged like that, this kind of one continuous piece of land, when we think about it, that's quite different from the way we have traditionally and continue to conceive of the Earth. This idea, again, the mostest for the leastest, we talk about that in a different place, but this idea from Buckminster Fuller is exactly that: maximum gain from energy, minimum input, specifically energy input, but any kind of minimum input. Talked about Vitruvius. It's all here. I do want you to know these 6 things and what they mean, and we'll apply these ideas in some way. It's all there. If you don't remember who Vitruvius is or what the relevance is, because we're talking about something that happened 2,000 years ago, Google it, and that will give you the context. Otherwise, this is the stuff. These 6 ideas and what they mean. This is Papineau. Again, the only important thing about design is how it relates to people, and I hope you can see that connection to Vitruvius. Vitruvius's whole idea was that things fit to a human scale, or rather, the human scale is the scale from which all design should devolve. Although Vitruvius is talking about architecture, we can apply it, and it's absolutely appropriate to completely apply it to any kind of design that we're talking about throughout history, and of course, very importantly, in the contemporary environment. Hans Monderman, for example, the traffic engineer, his idea of shared space. Traffic engineer doesn't sound like the most exciting job on earth, and yet his solution to a traffic problem in the Netherlands, which has then since been tried out in other environments, was a remarkable way of changing the way designers think. Sure, we're talking about civic design, we're talking about civil engineering, we're talking about a whole lot of different kinds of design, but it all comes down to how do designers think, how do they approach a problem, how do they shift the parameters of the problem so that the solutions are not just reproducing old hat solutions which have only piecemeal worked in the past. How do you actually create solutions that work? Again, if you don't know the whole story of Hans Monderman, Google him and you'll find out. It's pretty straightforward. Talked a bit about this guy, Carl DeSalvo. Again, if you have the time, I recommend maybe watching one of his videos. There's one on Vimeo that's fairly short, him presenting this idea specifically of adversarial design. The book he wrote was called Adversarial Design, and it's the idea that adversarial design is a type of political design, as it says here. His idea being that the political problems of the world, maybe not all of them, or maybe not completely, but they can be considered, they are part of all kinds of design. And again, we're talking about every kind of design, from art and even from paintings themselves to industrial design to products, and even to extending to things like Hans Monderman's civil design projects. So again, recall Carlos Alba, if you don't Google him, you can get information about him there. This idea of agonism, drawing from that, this is more of a political theory idea, but I would like you to be able to work that into a discussion about adversarial design if it comes up, and what agonism means. That if we, in democratic society, if we insist on consensus, if we insist that everyone agrees all the time and we all sort of expect that everyone's going to walk away happy, well, then we're going to be disappointed, first of all. And secondly, that's not the kind of goal we should be after in the first place. We should accept that people are going to inherently disagree about things, and that we should say is a good thing. The best thing to do is try to get people to come as close as possible, perhaps, but then embrace those differences and use those differences, most importantly. And as designers, you certainly know about that, how to use the problem in your favor rather than bitching about it and saying, well, I can't solve this problem. What you do is you say, okay, how is this problem actually an advantage, and how can I use it to solve other problems, or how do I shift it around to solve this problem? Anyway, you know that better than I do. Agonism is basically just taking that idea and blowing it up to the society level. We don't want to silence debate, we want to use it. We also talked about ad hocism, and I do want you to know this word. Again, Google it if you don't remember what it means. But this idea of associating different elements, solving problems based on just the immediate. The example I used in class was using a table edge to open a beer bottle, an old tire turned into a swing, all the way through to all the different ways in which design is sometimes not well thought out ahead of time. It's sometimes just a solution to problems, and we looked at how that appears in political protests, the way that tear gas is contended with, for example, but we also look at it in the way that the iPhone cobbled in other ideas from all sorts of other cell phone technologies to make this ideal kind of perfect smartphone, if you want to put it like that. Very little of that technology was brand new. What was interesting about it was how it was kind of thrown together, and that it's not ad hocism directly, but that draws from some of the strengths of ad hocism. Talked about actor network theory to a degree. I don't expect you to have a full grasp of this. I confess I don't even have a full grasp of this. It's a pretty complex idea, but basically what it talks about is emphasizing the space between objects themselves, meaning the example I gave was in the supermarket shelf. Actor network theory isn't as interested in the jars of mustard and barbecue sauce and olives. What actor network theory asks is what happens between them. Is it important that they're next to each other? If they're moved around, does something new happen when the people come in to buy the olives and the barbecue sauce? Actor network theory treats all the objects and the spaces in between, all the context, the entire kind of history of the supermarket itself, basically, as part of an equal set of relationships. So actor network theory wants to know about these relationships rather than just purely isolating the objects and treating them as some kind of something in a vacuum. Again, Google it if you don't fully understand what I'm talking about there. And again, of course, I can try to respond to questions to that. We talked about ethics, the difference between ethics and morality. Definitely not going to go back through all of this. Again, a lot to be said on this online. Basically, the difference between the system of making choices and the way that rules are followed. This is all here on this slide. The big thing was ethics is about balance, and so the example I gave was of charity, the idea of charity. It's, this time of year, there's a lot of charities going around asking for cash, basically, and volunteering and other things. On the one hand, you can give nothing, and so then you're miserly, you're not very generous, you are not a very good citizen, you might say. On the other hand, there's profligacy, being too generous. Give all your money away, give all your time away, well then you just create other problems for yourself and for other people. It really isn't good to be profligate, to just give it all away. So generosity is this space in between. You give what you can, maybe sometimes you give a little bit more, sometimes you give a little bit less, but generally you're generous. That's the way to be a good ethical citizen. Now remember, this is just an example. This applies to anything. Up here where we have charity, we could have just about any other concept that we have to deal with in society. And if we think in terms of this, what are the extremes and how do we cut a middle course? You're there kind of beginning to look at what the ethical course is. The difference between relative and absolute ethics, the idea that ethics are entirely context-based, versus the idea that ethics have this kind of absolute value, and that's where it begins to connect a little bit more with morality. We talked a lot about that in class. I used this painting as the example to show that the absolute ethical values that are being expressed in this painting continue to apply in our context. We couldn't disagree that it makes more sense for 3 soldiers to die than 10,000 soldiers to die. We probably wouldn't agree that sometimes sacrificing something, maybe not your life, we could debate that, but selflessness of some kind in favor of a greater good is a good thing. We could say that those are absolutes. They applied 300 years ago when this painting was painted, 200 something years ago when this painting was painted. They still apply today. The relativism, the relative ethics of this picture, we would, however, begin to question. There's a lot of propaganda and manipulation of a storyline going on here. There are these ideas of masculinity which we would have to challenge, we would have to question. Again, none of these things are said to be wrong, but what relativism says is that once the context shifted, as it has in the 200 years since this painting has been painted, certain standards have changed. We have certain changes of belief, questions of patriotism, question of the relationship between the identity, the male identity and the female identity. What this painting represents obviously has a lot going on that we would need to challenge and be critical of. And so there we see the relative values at work. And that's the difference. That's the example. This whole example is to try to illustrate the difference between absolute values, or somewhat absolute values, and relative values. Talked about the ethics of this guy, William Le Mesurier, his whole story with the building at what was called the Citicorp Center. Now it's just 601 Lexington Avenue, and this fantastic, interesting, exciting building, and what happens when a student, an undergraduate student at Princeton, pointed out that the building might not be safe in the wind. The point, the essential point here, and I really need to emphasize this now, when you Google this, what you'll hear is William Le Mesurier is an ethical hero because he blew the whistle on himself, and he called Citicorp and told them that he'd built a shoddy building and he needed to make some repairs. This, however, my point was, that's not really ethical. Like, that's just kind of the obvious, necessary thing to do. And if he hadn't done that, he'd be a bad person ethically, but he'd be a bad person morally, and he'd be a bad person legally. There's very little of ethics in the act of blowing the whistle on himself. This setup here was what he said he wrote an article, kind of an autobiographical thing about this whole period. And he said as he was driving back from his summer cottage, whatever, coming back into the city, he was just feeling like, you can imagine, he built this massive building and now it was going to fall down and kill a whole lot of people. He felt pretty terrible about it. So he felt he had 3 options: just do nothing, ignore it, commit suicide. He literally said he thought about driving into a bridge, or blow the whistle on himself. And of course he chooses blow the whistle. Now again, the story that is often told about him is, wow, isn't that ethical? He blew the whistle on himself instead of doing nothing. And of course commit suicide is kind of doing nothing. But that to me is not the actual ethical thing here. The ethical issue. The ethical question was that when he first got the call from the student, yeah, he blew the whistle. There we go. The ethical thing was when he got the call from the student, or when he didn't even take the call. When he heard about this question that had come from a student, somewhere in the back of his mind, he thought, that's an interesting question. And we know this because he says he thought about teaching his students. He was teaching an architecture course at Columbia at the time. He thought about turning it into an interesting problem, maybe an exam question, or just something to talk about in lecture. So he obviously knew that there was something interesting there. At that point, he could have said, you know what, I got plenty of good examples. I've got plenty of good essay questions. I don't need to dig into that. But instead, because in the back of his mind he knew there was something interesting there, and what the interesting thing was that he hadn't taken into account the way the wind blows when the building is structured differently, as this one was, with the supports in the center of the sides rather than the support at the edges of the building. So he knew that there was something there, deep subconsciously in the back of his mind, like a little tiny weeny little itch. And it was the ethical choice was to turn into that and say, yes, I am going to look at that itch. I'm going to start scratching at that point. It would have been very easy. And here's the thing, most people would have said, you know what, I'm just going to leave it. I got plenty of good essay questions. I don't need to explore this question anymore. The ethical point here is that he did the right thing by leaning into it and saying, right, what isn't this interesting? And then beginning to pull it apart and realizing that there was a big problem there. So the ethical thing is not blowing the whistle on himself, although there is ethics involved with that. The real ethical thing was him thinking about this question, and I spend time doing it now because it is very important that we get that difference. If there's a problem with ethics in our society today, it's that people assume that it's something legal. Basically, someone's going to catch me if I don't do this thing. And that is not what ethics needs to be about. Ethics is actually about how we think and how we choose to think and how we choose to control our thoughts. And there's a lot in that. There's a whole lot of discussion to be had there. But that's William the Mesurier story. We talked about sustainability. We talked about what it means and these ideas of endurance and defensibility and maintenance, and how sustainability is a word that's used to mean environmentally friendly. It's used as a marketing campaign, but it is also an issue that encompasses so much of how we will continue to live on our planet along with everything else. Selfish interests first, if we like, but the broader interests as well. What does sustainability really mean? We talked about systems thinking, how that plays into sustainability. If designers think in terms of systems rather than isolated objects or isolated projects, then we're going to get much more productive solutions to issues of sustainability as well as all other design issues. Emphasis on biomimicry. We did talk about these other kinds of uses of nature within design processes, just the sort of superficial modeling it on the aesthetics. Bionics, in which there is something more of looking into biological processes, but biomimicry, where it's the entire process and system that is studied for understanding entire human systems and problems rather than just specific strategic problem solving. There were some examples. I gave you the example of the whale power company, but there are lots of examples, of course, Velcro being kind of the most obvious one. We talked a little bit about kitsch now, moving on from sustainability, what that means and how it relates to taste. We talked a little bit about Kant. We're going to talk about Kant in the final lecture this week. Well, the final lecture, whenever you're watching this video. We talked a little bit about Immanuel Kant in the 18th century, and I wanted to emphasize in this instance his idea of pleasure, the difference between kind of personal pleasure, that's the taste of the senses, and then this universal pleasure, the taste of reflection. Now, it does connect to some of those other ideas we talked about in the last lecture, relating to ideas of the sublime and the beautiful, which of course I also expect you to have a grasp on for lecture, for the test, excuse me. But for this, in this instance, when we were talking about taste, we were talking about this difference between a personal sort of sense of pleasure lasting only a moment. A spoonful of ice cream is delicious, but it doesn't really last. We don't necessarily think about it very much several months afterwards. Universal taste is something that is much bigger. It applies to more people more generally, and it lasts. We talked a little bit about kitsch, specifically Clement Greenberg's idea that kitsch takes from high culture, fine art and high culture as he would call it, and we would maybe have some problems with those ideas, but the general idea that kitsch takes from high culture and dumbs it down to make it mass, to make it sellable. This is a quote from his essay, The Avant-Garde and Kitsch, he wrote in the 30s. What's important, although Greenberg is a problematic character perhaps, what's important is this idea of how design, to this day, uses the ideas that inform the definition of kitsch. So how does design take ideas from one place and apply them in the other? How does design come up with its own ideas? I'm definitely not saying that design can only be kitsch. What I'm definitely saying is that sometimes high design is absolutely at the peak of creativity. Um, but then sometimes other designers come along and companies come along and water down those ideas. And what is the impact of that, and how does that work? Talk about fad versus trend. The idea that a fad is sort of a perception of novelty, whereas a trend is more of a system change. It's all there. You can look into it if you're interested. I was interested in talking about the question of craft, whether the current interest in craft is a fad or whether it's a trend. And the answer I ultimately came up with, for myself at least in class, was that it's kind of both. It has faddish tendencies and it is used in a faddish way sometimes, but it is also a trend towards something, and a trend that began with William Morris in the 19th century. Talked about the role of politics, that it's all social interaction. It's not just who your prime minister is, but it's also how all human beings interact. And that design is a physical embodiment of some of those major political issues, and the impact that has on design and on society at large is an interesting one. Talked about the history of the Enlightenment, Age of Reason, and what that looks like. I really wanted to include this just as a representation of what Enlightenment design looks like. Now, they wouldn't have called it that, but these are the design principles. These are the beliefs of the Enlightenment, of natural laws, of rationality, of belief in rationality, and of course belief in the value of Republican Rome, put into physical objects. And so what I'm doing here is I'm showing you what politics looks like when it's turned into physical objects, and the way to do that is through design. And although this example is from the 18th century, 250 years later, we're still doing this. Pick up an iPad and tell me that has nothing to do with the politics of today, and I'll point out that it definitely does. Baron Haussmann, look him up if you don't remember him. He's the guy who made Paris look the way it does today. The whole history of that's design, that's city planning, that's design writ very large, and the impact it had on the people who had lived in these pokey little neighborhoods, but that were, well, authentic. And then Baron Haussmann comes along and creates this completely artificial, inauthentic space that we now think of as the authentic Paris. Now, of course, I'm using the word authentic very guardedly there, or very intentionally rather. But having done that reading, you know what I mean by that. And if you don't know, if you can't put that together with Baron Haussmann, read about him. Read about how Paris was overhauled in the second half of the 19th century, and you'll see what I mean. Talked about Albert Speer, Hitler's #1 architect, and his plans. This is what the folkish was the style, the sort of the design style of the Nazis, that it had to be for the people. So it's this kind of almost contradictory design style in which it's grassrootsy, it's sort of organic of the people, but at the same time it's massive. It's treating the people as one singular group. And I talked about the Volkshall here, the People's Hall, that was to be so large that the people would lose their individuality. It was never built. It would lose its individual. People would lose their individuality in the space where the Führer would be the center of attention in this massive space. So these are models. This down below is a real thing. This was a space that was actually built by Speer. No, I don't have the name on there. But just knowing Speer is useful. Jumping to the other end of the spectrum, Karl Hanisch emphasized that the personal was political, that the political starts with and comes from the individual person. She was connected with an organization that protested the Miss America pageant in the 1970s. This was the apocryphal burning of the bra, although that never actually happened, at least not at this event. It was the beginning of, it was a major part of a move, of a wave of feminism into a mainstream, changing the discussion, trying to change the discussion at least, and that those attempts and that discussion is still very, very much ongoing, and we're only half a step beyond where Karl Hanisch left it. and is still working away on it. So Google her name if you don't remember the rest of the story there. But how the political and how uh, uh, her story is all about small groups of women meeting and discussing and trying to figure out how to overcome problems, which can be massive societal problems to do with patriarchies, but it can also just be how to deal with much more localized problems, dealing with children, dealing with deciding whether or not to have children, dealing with husbands, deciding whether or not to have husbands. Those issues become the personal, or rather are the personal, which then becomes the political. Excuse me, and that there's a whole lot more there, but you need to read into that if you don't see already how this connects to things like sewing bees and quilting organizations throughout history, groups of women gathering together. You should certainly look into that. That's a powerful piece of our collective history, and one that shows how human beings operate and think, and how our society, how our history operates too. Anyway, a lot more there. Conspicuous consumption, talked about that recently. The idea coming from this guy, Thorsten Veblen, writing his book, The Theory of the Leisure Class. This was quite recent. I'm not going to rehearse the whole thing again, but the idea being that the rich, it's no good. You can't just hang a sign around your neck that says how big your bank account is. You have to consume things. You have to buy things and spend money in a certain way that shows how rich you are. Of course, it starts with your clothes and your house, but then, of course, it extends to what kind of things you do, what kind of books you read, what you do for fun at the weekend. You go to the opera, do you play polo? How many country houses do you own? Have you founded a university or started a national museum? This is what conspicuous consumption means. His claim in this book is nuanced and much more complicated, but it can be reduced in a certain way to focusing on the Rockefeller family and the fact that, yeah, they had so much money that it wasn't enough just to buy motor cars and airplanes and trains. They had to buy much, much bigger things, and so they set up universities and museums and charities, many of which still operate today. I used this picture to emphasize that, this Gainsborough painting, and of course this is a great example of that. If you don't recall how this painting encapsulates ideas of conspicuous consumption and positional goods, do a little bit of Googling. I think there's a good Khan Academy video about this. Look for a video on YouTube by a guy called John Berger. He's a guy a little bit goofy looking nowadays. He was very much a 1970s kind of guy, but he has a very interesting video in which he talks about what this painting really does with regards to claims of property ownership and a pride of conspicuous consumption. Positional goods, this idea that comes from Fred Hirsch, talked a lot about that goods are used to establish your position in society based on their scarcity. I talked a bit about Henry Ford. I'm slipping this in here because it is important that we know this. There could be no such thing as contemporary issues in design if it wasn't for things for Fordism. Henry Ford, the maker of the Model T, well, among other things, but that's what we're talking about. These ideas of standardization and assembly lines, not his invention, but the way he applied them, lays the groundwork for contemporary consumerism and contemporary production. Back to the Enlightenment, of course, and I did want you to get this word, Entzauberung, this idea of disenchantment, that the Enlightenment was all rationality, it was all carefully laid out, these natural laws, everything was logic and science, and there was this feeling in the middle of the 19th century that this led to a degree of disenchantment. What about the magic? What about the spiritual? What about the fantasy, the surprises of human existence? So there was kind of a backlash to the Enlightenment. We see people like Nietzsche show up, and we saw some other examples, and how inspiration. This was last week's lecture. What I talked about, the emphasis here on inspiration, on fantasy, as one of our authors in the first week, Helfand, talked about. That design comes from fantasy, from imagining a better world, from imagining a crazily better world. How wild can we get with our imagination? And that's part of what we can get from Entzauberung and that response to the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment seems to, and it's not as simple as this, but it does seem to deny the capacity for open-ended aesthetic thinking in which we allow our subjective experience to completely inform our ideas and not even worry about it. Dream as big as you like. And of course, there's a lot of power in that. But it's a balance. And so ultimately, it's this balance between skill and skills and inspiration, fantasy, idea, imagination, combining to ability. And this, of course, my point that I kept going on about, is where I see you guys. Craft and design is ability. Final thing we talked about last week was designing for disabilities, or with disabilities in mind, and this idea that if you design with the constraints of disabilities, you make better designs for everyone. And I gave you some examples of that. We talked about Amy Mullins. She's not without problems, but she is a very interesting and inspiring character, and she has certainly altered the public discussion about what disabilities mean. If you don't know, if you don't recall what that is, you can look that up. But the whole idea that that disabilities, the conversation has changed completely in the last 100 years or so, and how we design today should be very much informed by that. Universal design, something to look into. I'm going to talk a little bit about that tomorrow, I think. There we go. Questions, whatever, as always. The format of the test will be such that I'm not going to expect you to just regurgitate ideas. That's why I'm letting you take in that one sheet of paper with facts, whatever, written down on. I don't care what you write on there. The questions will then synthesize this information. I'm going to take different ideas, tie them together, and ask you to think about things. You may encounter some things that are not mentioned here, but what I will then ask you to do is to take those, to analyze those things. I'll give you all the information you need. There's no trickery. It's going to be just how well do you get the general flow of the ideas, the general arc of the story, which has been these contemporary issues. All of these are the contemporary issues in design.